This is Paul Nobles from eattoperform.com. I am normally sitting here with April Blackford, but for some reason April is not here. And so until she shows up, I am going to run through the questions. We already have a question from Zach Thompson, and I just wanted to say to everybody that if you could get me questions, especially with no April, it's going to be difficult to fill the time without a steady stream of questions. And luckily, like I said, we have one question already. And so Zach's asking, he says he's new to ETP, and April recommended I eat 3,100 calories, but start out 2,000 and build myself up. What can those newly starting out expect to see as a result, especially those practically doubling their previous intake? Well, 2,000 is probably a bit low, but I think I understand where she was going with it. The idea is that you would gradually work up to the 3,100. What she's probably trying to do is just not scare the hell out of you. And frankly, most people, I mean, 2,000 kind of seems pretty low, especially for someone that's supposed to be eating 3,100. As an example, my total daily energy expenditure is about 2,800, and I do eat that most every single day. And so for someone that's supposed to be at 3,100 calories, 2,000 may actually be a little bit low. Oftentimes when people start off, they are coming from a background of under eating. So what we're essentially doing is kind of reverse dieting for them. And in reverse dieting is sort of what April is saying, is you kind of take the lessons that you've learned under eating, you know, whether that be paleo, whether it be some other dieting, or really, you know, the way that a lot of people interpret these are almost as an extreme diet. And so what we try to teach you is kind of reverse out of that and start establishing some healthy behavior. One of the interesting things, actually, we were just talking about this with someone in the forums, and they were sort of surprised at the calorie point, and this was a female smaller than you are, Zach. But one of the interesting things she said was, am I really supposed to eat that much? And I asked her why, you know, she was going to participate in the challenge, and she's like, well, I want to lose fat. And I don't know her exact calories, but let's say that she was at 1,500 calories. And let's say that she had been at 1,500 calories for quite some time, because that sounds like what your situation was a little bit. People view fat loss, for instance, let's say that you were doing Weight Watchers, okay? And the goal of Weight Watchers really isn't for you to lose fat, it's for you to lose weight. So therefore, if you just constantly lose, you know, weight after weight after weight, when you first start off, you're more likely to lose fat. But as you go more and more aggressive down the road, really your muscle starts to atrophy. And so as the more aggressive you get, the worse off it gets. So what people often forget is that the opposite also works. And so what I was explaining to her is that a big part of the fat loss equation is actually building muscle. And so she was 25% body fat. I believe she was like 135 pounds. And one of the things I explained to her is that if she could stay at that same weight, now we're talking almost theoretical here, because sometimes you have to maybe gain 2-3 pounds in that process. Let's see, that might be April actually. Oh shoot, it's not April. Okay, and so for instance, I mean, everyone would like to think that you can gain 7.5 pounds of muscle and your weight would stay the same. And I'm not saying that it's not impossible to do. It's just highly unlikely. What ends up happening for a lot of people is they end up gaining 2 or 3 pounds, and then when they bod pod, as an example, they'll find that they gain 5-6 pounds of muscle, and that's pretty much how it works. And so most people looking for fat loss have been looking to do so with a deficit for a long period of time, and what they experience is plateaus, struggling, workouts not being great, right? And so what we try and point out is that there is another end. And the interesting thing about it, when you talk to scientists that study muscle hypertrophy and things of this nature, they will often say that, you know, the average athlete can only gain, say, 1 pound of muscle a month, or, you know, they'll break it down into weeks and things of this nature. It's really highly dependent on the athlete. Because if, for instance, because it's very common for women to believe that they can't gain a lot of muscle in a short period of time. We've seen women gain 8 pounds of muscle in 3 months. That's verified by DEXA scan, which most scientists would believe is a good accounting of how you've actually gained muscle. Well, what was the reason why that person gained 8 pounds of muscle? Well, they were severely deficient in calories. They were severely deficient in protein. When you look at how you've been eating, Zach, what you will see is that those deficiencies ultimately haven't allowed you to perform to your best, but also haven't allowed for muscle maintenance and muscle building. So you'll be able to typically build a good amount of muscle in a very short period of time. The other thing that I was going to say, and kind of my last point, is that you will experience like a little bloating. You know, anytime, you know, I mean, as an example, yesterday I went to an outdoor concert with my daughter, and the food choices were basically, you know, like hamburgers and French fries and Gatorade, you know, for the most part. I could have drank water, but honestly, I would have been dehydrated. It was really hot, and at those moments, Gatorade was just a better choice. Well, certainly I felt a bit bloated, and when I went on the scale this morning, that was reflected, and pretty simple to deal with. And this is actually one of the ways that we have people deal with some of the bloating that you may feel adding in an appropriate amount of calories. So you add in an appropriate amount of calories. For a lot of people coming from a low carbohydrate background, they're going to want to add some carbohydrate. Will that have you feeling bloated? It probably will, because your cells at this point are somewhat resistant to carbohydrate, so you sort of want to get it back used to using carbohydrate as a fuel. And so the thing that you want to do is not forget the fact that on rest days, as an example, you can just eat normal, or eat, mostly whole foods. So like today, as an example, coming from a day where I had to eat a bunch of stuff that I normally wouldn't eat, basically today I just kind of went low-ish carb. My carbs will probably be somewhere 125 to 150. My calories are probably a little lower today. It's a rest day. So I'm guessing my calories are probably going to be somewhere around 1,800 to 2,000 calories. Normally, like I said, I eat 2,800 to 3,000 calories, but that should be enough to kind of get that inflammation, which is what bloating is, right? Bloating is essentially water outside the cells that haven't loaded into your muscle, or basically left your body through urine or sweat or something of that nature. And so when you ask, what are some of the changes that you'll experience, those are some of the changes that you'll experience. One thing I will say, though, is you should be seeing performance gains almost immediately. And if you want to be a little cautious, for instance, let's say that you decided, you know what, I'm just going to dive right into the Eat to Perform thing and go to 2,500 calories. What I would suggest is you lean more towards post-workout rather than the pre-workout, and then add the pre-workout in, because your body's going to be more receptive to loading the carbohydrate post-workout. And so, for instance, going from, let's say, 100 grams of carbohydrate to, let's say, 275, which might be what is recommended, Um, you might want to work up to that 275 number, starting with post-workout, then gradually lower, adding a small amount of pre-workout. But that pre-workout is a big part of the deal, and I would highly encourage everyone to really add that in, because that's going to give you available energy. I mean, the one thing about energy, and a lot of people that argue that you don't really need pre-workout, I'm not arguing that you couldn't get by without it. But my argument is that why wouldn't you want to have available energy to make your workouts better? You know, and obviously time of day, many different factors come into play, but in general, you want to have ready energy available to work out better. So I hope that helps. Hit me with a follow-up question if any of that was confusing, and then we'll just kind of run through things. But Allison is asking a question. She says, just signed up, want to make sure I understand correctly. She works out in the morning at 9:30 a.m. Should do pre-workout meal and then breakfast after, so like 10:30 to 10:30 to, I think she means 1 p.m. and then shoot, I can't understand what she's saying here. Let's see. Just signed up. Want to make sure I understand correctly. I work out in the morning, 9:30 a.m. Allison, what time do you wake up? I should do pre-workout meal and then breakfast after, so like 10:30 to 1 p.m. and then lunch. Looking for some time frames. Okay, so she's saying she wakes up at 7 a.m. Well, that's actually a tricky time, and if I were to work out at 7 a.m., I would not eat. You can eat if you feel comfortable eating. If you feel better eating, I would certainly recommend you do so. Yeah, you're saying you work out at 7 a.m. and you work out at 9:30 a.m. So normally I would not eat in that scenario because it's only 2 hours and 30 minutes. Essentially, the reason why I wouldn't, you know, and once again, this is up to you and your comfort level and things of this nature, but the reason why I wouldn't is because I like to eat about 2 hours before. Anytime. And so what that would mean is I would have to wake up at 7 a.m., start choking down food around 7:30, and then work out at 9:30. I routinely wake up at, I wake up at about 6 a.m., I work out at 9:30 a.m., and I don't typically eat in that process, because what I'm going to be doing is getting my carbohydrates from the night before. And so what I would highly suggest to you is getting an adequate amount of carbohydrates in your evening meals, maybe having like some kind of dessert. You know, we haven't really talked about it a whole lot, but the coconut milk smoothie as an example that we have on the site. If you guys haven't seen that recipe, you can ask for it in the forums, and most people will be able to get you that recipe. Those will give you a lot of energy going into the morning time. So what do I do as a pre-workout? Well, typically I will have some type of caffeine. Usually in the instance of a 9:30 a.m. workout, you know, it sort of depends on what time it is, on what type of caffeine I take and how I comfortably take it. I often take caffeine pills in the form of Vivarin with my pre-workout drink, but in the morning time I feel more comfortable with espresso, so I just go to the drive-thru at the local coffee shop, get a double espresso, and then work out. Let's see. So could you suggest some times for meals for my day? Absolutely. So once again, let's say that you could eat before 9:30. We would not suggest to you that you shouldn't eat, but what I might suggest to you is that you have something kind of lighter on your stomach. In that scenario, you know, I might have something like, you know, Greek yogurt with a little strawberries and honey. That might be something that wouldn't kind of weigh on me, that so it's just a matter of kind of finding what works for you. I like to have carbohydrate in that if I am going to eat it. In your case, it's just dependent on whether or not that feels comfortable. I think your time frame of 10:30 to 1 p.m. is dead on. There's no real reason that you have to quit working out at 10:30 and then start slamming like eggs and sweet potatoes and pork chops and all this extreme amount of food. So if I were you, I would just once again find out what's comfortable for you, but I would always have carbohydrate in that post-workout meal because it's a great opportunity, especially if you are just doing something like my pre-workout protocol where you would just be having something like caffeine. So I hope that helps. There really is no wrong in terms of the post-workout window. The pre-workout, if you can do it, feel free to do so, but it's not something that you need to do as long as you're getting in adequate amounts of carbohydrate the night before. And the reason being is that your muscle glycogen levels won't necessarily go down in an extreme manner overnight. Let's see, can your post-workout be a full-on meal? Absolutely. It just depends, like I said, on whether or not you can stomach it. As an example, a lifting workout, a lifting workout, I can eat, a steak, sweet potato, salad, it doesn't affect me at all. If I have like a high intensity WOD, usually I'm going to have to wait, like you said, till about 1 p.m. Just kind of let my stomach settle down and eat better and have more volume of food. Typically, I like to have bigger meals because I like my stomach to be stretched and I like to feel full. And so that's one of the arguments that I make for having bigger meals. Some people prefer it differently. There's no real, there's arguments for and against both ways, but it always comes down to personal preference as a general rule. And she was thinking, okay, I was thinking it needed to be small. It does not need to be small. The biggest argument, as an example, from my perspective, on having, let's say, post-workout protein, and then I'll give you the reason why I wouldn't. But the reason why you would is so you can meet your overall protein levels. One of the things that I would say, though, that ends up being kind of a negative is that if post-workout you drink protein, oftentimes that will fill you up, and then you actually end up eating less food, for your lunchtime meal. I'd rather you actually have real food in that scenario. So I hope that's helpful. Let me know if you have any follow-up questions. Lisa was saying she eats primarily paleo with the exception of half and half of my coffee in the morning. According to the calculator, it says I need to eat 135 grams of protein, 291 grams of carbs, and 75 grams of fat. This was the suggested 75 to 100 grams. My question about the carbs, is that too many? I know that I don't eat this many carbs in a day right now. It really sort of depends on what your goals are. If your goals are to gain muscle, as an example, for instance, if you took the calculator and you put it at 100 grams of fat, essentially that would lower the carbs. Let's see, 25 times 90, so it would lower the carbs about 50. So then you would basically be at like 241 grams of carbs. So you could go that approach, having a little bit more fat to lower your carbs a little bit. One of the things that we see, and one of the reasons why this happens, is When your fats are kind of lower like that, that ends up being a plus, especially for someone coming from an underfed background. And one of the reasons is when you're coming from an underfed background, there's kind of a negativity related to insulin. And rightly so. You don't want insulin jacked up all the time and things of this nature. But with Eat to Perform, what we're trying to do is kind of get you to kind of use your insulin and become more insulin sensitive rather than insulin resistant. And so with that many carbs as an example, and your fat's kind of a little bit lower, 75 grams of fat is actually quite a bit of fat in the regular population. It's just in the paleo, performance, athletic performance world, these numbers are kind of normal for us. But when the fats are kind of low like that and the carbs are higher, it allows the insulin to maintain and potentially build muscle because of the protein turnover. And so insulin is sort of thought to be a storage hormone, and that's what kind of like the negative people sort of always put out there, that insulin is a storage hormone. Let me tell you something about insulin. Let's say that you're supposed to be eating 2,500 calories a day, and you're eating 1,800 calories a day, and a lot of it is from carb sources and therefore insulin. Well, first of all, you'd be hungry all the time. But secondly, you would not store fat in that scenario. You're really going to be storing fat when your numbers are higher than your calorie point, right? And so in that way, kind of the myth of insulin sort of gets debunked. Now, whether or not you're eating adequate amounts of food and whether or not you're eating, in balance, those are all other issues. But in general, if you're supposed to be eating 2,500 calories and you are eating 1,800 calories, you're not going to be storing fat as a general rule. So what is happening? Well, in that instance, your body is actually trying to build because you're not giving it enough food, but really not getting enough of all the different things that really allow you to kind of end up kind of seeing your potential from eating with a purpose. And so that's why we sort of put people and give them these guidelines in the beginning, and then we start to make adjustments as they go. She's saying that with a follow-up, let's see. Oh, I'm sorry. I got a follow-up from somebody else. Let's see. So for Lisa, what I would say is, if the carbs scare you, you can move move up to 100 grams of fat. It does somewhat depend a little bit on how you were eating before. And so if you haven't been in the forums, or if somebody from the forums gave you these macros, just make sure that you're constantly checking in with people. And one of the things that, I know everybody has kind of a different relationship with the scale. Me, I'm a fan of the scale because I think that it will give you guys a direct indicator on whether or not you're kind of meeting your goals. Lisa is following up saying, my goal is to lean out. My only carbs were from fruits or veggies. Well, the nice thing about leaning out, and I alluded to this earlier, is that leaning out, there's really two parts of the process. There's the building muscle part, which sounds like you probably need more of, and then there's the losing fat part. Well, if, for instance, you stay the same weight, this is my argument for checking in the scale and making sure that your scale's not going, extremely high, or really, it's normal to move up, let's say 2 or 3, sometimes even 5 pounds when someone's kind of dramatically underfed. But what we'll often see is once people start to get their calorie point up, their protein point up, and enough carbohydrate to kind of stimulate, not necessarily the, to be able to use insulin as a building hormone. right? Because like I said earlier, everybody wants to talk about it as a storage hormone. I think it's more accurate to say that insulin is a building hormone. And so, for instance, if you're, we talked about if your calorie point is 2,500 and you're eating 1,800, you're not going to store. If your calorie point is 2,500, but you're constantly eating over 3,200, now insulin does become a building hormone in that it builds fat. Assuming, of course, that you don't have a resistance training program, and therefore, you might be building muscle in that scenario. So there's, lots of points to all of this. And so what we're just trying to do is kind of introduce you guys to some of the opposite point of view, because basically the only formula that everybody has out there, and in this way I think that Eat to Perform is saying something very, very unique. What we're saying is that if you're constantly in a deficit, it doesn't allow your body to get to a point where Mike T. Nelson refers to this as an expansion model. And so they're only looking at it as deficit, deficit, negative, negative, lower calorie, when it's actually the opposite that allows them, when you have kind of a best of both worlds. Yes, it might take a little bit more patience and a little bit more refinement, but that's why we have the Science Lab. That's why we have the resources in place like the webinar, so you can come in, walk away. Many of you guys are throwing some numbers at me. Most of those are going to be starting numbers. Then you're going to start to get some indicators. Once you have those indicators, may it be the scale, it might be your workouts, it's all these different things. Then you come back to us and say, well, Paul, the scale is up 2 to 3 pounds. What do you think I should do in this scenario? And in a lot of cases, I'm going to say nothing, because that's really not a lot of weight gain. But occasionally, someone will go, well, I started Eat to Perform, been doing it for about 2 months, feel great, but I've gained 10 pounds. Well, is this the first time I've ever talked to you? Because that's a negative. You shouldn't be gaining 10 pounds on Eat to Perform unless that's your goal, because it's very rare for someone to gain 10 pounds of muscle that quickly. It's not unheard of, but in general, it's very rare. You would have had to come from a severely deficient background and then, just started, resistance training program, coming from never done it and things of this nature. So, what I would say to you guys is, starting off, you're going to always want to check in and make sure that you're getting support, because that's what we're here to do. And so I hope that helps, Lisa. I know I was a little bit all over the board there. That's one of the problems. Normally, April does keep me in check, but tonight I'm probably going to be a little more long-winded since we don't have someone else. Let's see. Alejandra is saying, sometimes it's difficult for me to lower my carbs to 125 on control days. Sometimes I do 170, but when I see my calorie deficit, it's about 400, 500 deficit. Doesn't matter. Definitely is better going 125. It 100% does not matter. The one thing that I want you guys to understand is I never really want protein to change. I would actually argue that there's probably a bigger argument for drinking protein on the days that are your rest days or control days, because oftentimes your calorie points aren't higher. But if you're looking for 400 to 500 calorie deficit on your control days or rest days, you can get that from fat as well as carbohydrate. And so if 125 does not feel comfortable and 170 does, that's fine. Just lower your fats a small amount as well to offset the difference. So I hope that makes sense. One of the things that I definitely want everybody to hear, because oftentimes people in these classes are relatively new to Eat to Perform, and they'll start with their macros, and they will start working out, and they view those macros as the end-all be-all and they eat like that every single day, when in fact the way that you're supposed to eat to perform is try and use some level of rest days. You know, we actually argue for more rest days that allows for you to have more control days, meaning lower calorie points, and kind of keep fat in check. Sometimes people just choose to work out more than that. One of the things you can try in that scenario is to have one of those days as sort of a tempo day and also use it as a control day. But frankly, I think what ends up happening in a lot of situations like that is the people just end up taking that extra day off because, you know, when you exercise and you keep your calorie point lower, oftentimes it's a kind of a cortisol cocktail, and so you end up holding on to fat as a result or holding on to weight as a result. But, you know, that's largely dependent on the individual. For some people that works. I can say sometimes that works for me. Usually it works a little bit better when I'm doing low intensity work. But yeah, you know, there's lots of things that you can try in that scenario. Alejandro also had a follow-up saying normal macros, 100 to 120 protein, 55 60 fat. That seems kind of low. 270 carbs. Sometimes I overdo them. I have problems doing the opposite of the most people. I eat a lot. That does not sound a lot to me. I know that you think that 270 carbs might actually be a lot, but in fact, you know, when you look at the average person, 270 carbs is not that much. I think those macros are fine if you find that those are working for you, but I would constantly check in within the forums, you know, get the ear of a moderator and just, you know, make sure that, you know, you're sort of headed in the direction that you want to go. Height very small. 42 weight, my goal is to put more muscle. I already have, but I need more muscle and lean out. Let's see, the thing is I don't really master 270. I overdo them. Yeah, well, that, you know, those are one of the things that you can kind of try to rein in. Sometimes you can overdo carbohydrate by keeping your fat calories too low or your protein calories too low. If, as an example, you are 120 pounds, I would try and get closer to that 120. Oftentimes, you know, fats and protein will keep you more full, and therefore less cravings as it relates to carbohydrate. That's another argument for keeping your carbohydrates separate of your proteins and fats. So I'm kind of similar to you in that if I kind of go down the road of carbohydrate, I will often overdo it. And so what I do as a result is I kind of keep I work out in the evenings, so I'm able to keep most of my carbohydrates in the evening, and therefore I can keep my carbohydrate macros in line a little bit easier. If I sort of start down the carbohydrate road at, say, 8:30 a.m., oftentimes I will find that I want to eat more carbohydrate rather than fat, and that isn't necessarily always going to be great as it relates to kind of keeping my macros in line. So that would be something I would play with. I think that that's more of a behavior modification type thing. If you find that you struggle with that, that might be one of the suggestions I would make to you. But in general, you know, oftentimes people will say, man, once I start opening the door to carbohydrates, you know, the floodgates open. Well, the reality is that maybe the floodgates are opening because you are under eating. And so I would probably take a look at a few other things. I would first look at that behavior modification, trying to put a little bit more of your carbohydrates at the end of the day, but then also look at Are you eating adequate amounts for your level of activity? Because like you said, you're looking to lean out, put on a little bit of muscle, things of this nature. Your formula is actually pretty good. What you just need to figure out is that sweet spot on how much you're eating to where you don't ultimately overeat, and you can kind of lean out as a result. But in general, I kind of like your macros. I think what I see for a lot of people is they want to keep their fats really super high, but it really doesn't allow for that muscle protein turnover when they do that. Ricardo is saying, so Alejandra, I hope I'm pronouncing your name correctly. If you have any follow-ups, just hit me up with that, but I hope that helps your question. Let's see, Ricardo's saying, works out fasted at 6 a.m. The bulk of my carbs should be split between the night before and right after my workout. And throughout the day, I should focus on protein and carbs. Okay, I think what you mean at the last part of your question is throughout the day, you should focus on proteins and fats. That is correct. And yes, you are correct, night before and then after. Okay, so the question being, and this is a great question, I think this is something that everybody needs to hear, do I avoid carbohydrates? In this instance, would he avoid carbohydrates? Let's say that he works out at 6 a.m., he's able to eat breakfast around 8:30. Would he avoid carbohydrates at lunch? For myself, I cannot avoid carbohydrates at lunch, so I always allow for somewhere in between 30 to 50 grams of carbohydrates with lunch, partially because I've found that my digestion isn't as good, and it kind of affects me negatively, and so that little bit of carbohydrate just sort of helps everything kind of keep in the right direction. It's not an extreme amount of carbohydrate. I am eating mostly proteins and fats and fibrous vegetables at that point. So something like a big, salad, with, like taco salad with ground beef or something of that nature is a great lunch. Maybe with some avocados, something of that nature. If you wanted to have like some tortilla chips or something of that nature in the salad, just to kind of get in 20 grams to 30 grams of carbohydrates, I think that that's a good thing, or at least for me that works out well. So the point being, should you avoid carbohydrate completely? Is that somehow magical? I would say no, it's not magical. That if you're eating avocado, ground beef with 85-15, the amount of fat in that meal is going to blunt any carbohydrate you have response, especially like if you're only having 20 to 30 grams of carbohydrate. Like I said, that will often enhance, people will find that, digestively that works a little bit better. So I would not avoid it, unless that feels right for you, right? If it's something that you can get away with, you don't need the extra calories. I mean, as an example, 30 grams of carbohydrates, 120 calories. So if you can take 120 calories out of that meal and still walk away comfortable, there's no reason why you shouldn't do that. So it really comes down to personal preference. Like I said, for me, personal preferences, I like to keep a little bit in. Let's see. And so also, since my workouts are early in the morning, does my control day start the night before a non-workout day? See, this is where I always get in trouble. This is why April, I don't want to say tricky, but in general, one of the reasons why I like pre-workout carbs is because it gives me ready, available energy for my workout. Okay? So I'm going into a control day or rest day where I'm not going to be doing a whole lot. Guess what? A lot of times I'm not going to eat a whole lot of carbohydrate at that point. So in your instance, as an example, you might have a little bit of carbohydrate in your post-workout. You would then go to fats, proteins, fibers, vegetables. Your evening meal then would be fats, proteins, fibers, vegetables. Maybe save a little carbohydrate. Um, One of the biggest strategies that I have for people as it relates to fat loss is to save some carbohydrates right before bed. It helps you sleep better. It gives you kind of a little bit of a goal to shoot for. I mean, like control days and things of that nature aren't always comfortable, and so this allows for you to have an incentive to adhere to the plan, right? And so if you have some incentive, you have like a little 30 to 50 grams of dessert, maybe like some kind of fruit with Greek yogurt or something like that. I think that ends up being a plus. Coconut milk smoothie, when I am in a calorie deficit, as an example, which doesn't happen that often, but if I am looking to be in a calorie deficit, I always have that coconut milk smoothie by the end of the day. That way I'm kind of adhering. So let's run through the scenario. So you work out AM, you have a little bit of carbohydrate in your post-workout. You go fats, proteins, fibers, vegetables. Once again, not zero, but lowish. Fats, proteins, fibers, vegetables for dinner. And then the next day is your rest day. And so you're going to go fats, proteins, fibers, vegetables for breakfast, fats, proteins, fibers, vegetables for lunch, and then you're going to have some carbohydrates in your evening meal that time. And so what we've essentially done in that scenario, right, is most of the carbohydrate is going to be absorbed relatively quickly. So let's say that you ate at 8:30 a.m. Your insulin levels are going to kind of lower. They should stay low until your evening meal the following day, and so therefore it should give you an opportunity to kind of mobilize some fat, keep your calorie point low. That's the other thing that I think is really important for everybody to hear. When I say fats, proteins, fibers, vegetables, the one thing that we do different is we tell you that there is a calorie point involved, right? So if you go fats, proteins, fibers, vegetables, and your calorie point is 3,000, don't be surprised if you don't end up mobilizing fat as a result. You probably do need that calorie point to get a little bit lower. What we try to get you guys to do is to have that number being a very small amount that doesn't really bother you, right? And so for someone at 3,000, we'd probably get you to 2,500. For someone at 2,500, we get you to 2,000. Someone at 2,200 might get you to 1,800. So that's the general idea. But yeah, you would have almost, a day and a half, something like about 36 to 40 hours where your insulin would be relatively low, carbohydrate would be relatively low, and it should give you the opportunity to sort of lean out, get some inflammation through your body, and then kind of keep things headed in the right direction. So I hope that's helpful. Let me know if any of this is unclear. If I'm answering a question for somebody else and it brings up another question for you, please follow up for that person. This should all be a little more simple than it probably seems, right? Because what I was just explaining to Ricardo, it's actually pretty simple, right? Let's say you come from a paleo background and you were unintentionally eating pretty low, eating paleo. All we're saying is that if you can eat for a purpose and you can add some strategic carbohydrate, into your plan, right? On your control days or rest days, whatever you want to call them, basically just go back to your old paleo habits. One of the things I love about talking about paleo, it's really funny because I I understand, you know, the idea of people kind of hating on paleo, because I do agree that oftentimes it leads to people under eating unnecessarily, and I think that's a negative thing. But here's where I think paleo has a huge, huge advantage on a lot of other ways of eating. One, if you're going to keep carbohydrates mostly out of your diet, you know, or relatively low, you're going to depend on fats. That's a good thing. And you know, one of the things that we're trying to show, and an example that I just used with Ricardo, is when you are not working out, you should be mostly reliant upon fat. And so if you can keep your calorie point a little bit lower than your workout time, I just need to blow my nose here real quick, sorry. That'll keep your insulin low. That will keep you in a better position for fat loss, and you won't end up gaining a lot of weight as a result. Let's see. One of the follow-up questions to a question above was, I have another question. In women, the best way to stimulate testosterone is by lifting. That's one way. Let's see. Ronda Rousey would argue that sex is also another way to keep your testosterone up at a reasonable level. Or there is some food that helps. Think that we have lower T makes process different than men. You know, it's interesting because I've seen women actually make bigger muscle gains than men. And most of that is a result of the fact that, you know, men tend to not be as extreme as it relates to weight loss and fat loss, right? So when you have a woman that is coming from maybe a relatively restrictive way of eating, or a restricted way of thinking about food, and you make that right, they tend to see the best results. So I wouldn't get overly worried about the testosterone number. I would be more worried about making sure that you're the one thing you didn't mention there is rest. And I think that that's actually another big reason why women struggle, is because they struggle with the rest portion of things. I'm not saying that that's, you know, something that is just a function of males, you know, females versus males, but in general, guys are working with a higher calorie point. The math tends to be better. They tend to have more muscle. So what ends up happening for women, the math isn't as good, and so therefore they resort to more extremes, and those extremes ultimately end up looking like less food, more working out, and not enough rest, and potentially not enough sleep as a result. And so all those things are going to be favorable as it relates to testosterone. Let's also remember that there's another important part to this process that's not just testosterone. It's really growth hormone and IGF-1. And so what we need to do is get adequate amounts of sleep, because one of the things that I'll often see with people is if we can get them from sleeping 6 hours a day to 8 to 9 hours a day, oftentimes they will lean out a lot easier in the process. And so one of the jokes that I always make is that, is Jon Stewart keeping you fat? And the point being is that if you're watching late night TV to relax, you might just be better off just sleeping, you know, and you'll feel more refreshed as a result. You won't end up, you know, on the, you know, weekends end up sleeping for 9 to 10 hours because you have this big sleep deficit and things of this nature. And so there you go. So I hope that's helpful. And yeah, I mean, when you're not getting enough rest, you're not eating enough food, you know, stress is going to become an issue. You often see people go, well, I want to get my cortisol levels tested and things of this nature. It's like, well, yeah, you know, you don't need to test your cortisol levels if you've been dieting for the last 10 years and you're working out 6 days a week. I'll just tell you, your cortisol levels are high. You know, if you're plateaued and things of this nature and you've been banging your head against the wall for a long period of time, what often doesn't occur to people partially because they're scared shitless, right? They're scared because they're thinking, well, you know, I've lowered my calories to 1,300. It sort of like goes back to what Zach was saying. I've lowered my calories to 1,300, you know, and I'm not losing any fat. Well, if I go back up to 2,200, I'm going to gain weight. And yeah, you might gain a little bit of weight, but in general, your body's probably going to respond more favorably to that 2,200, and then it'll give you an opportunity to maybe go after some fat loss later on. But one of the things that I would really like for a lot of you guys to hear is that, you know, don't just come to Eat to Perform to go, I'm going to do Eat to Perform for a month, and then I'm going to go back to my extreme dieting ways. Give it a few months, you know, to kind of adjust, and make sure that, you know, you're kind of keeping your weight in a manageable area where you're only gaining anywhere from 2 to 5 pounds. 2 to 5 pounds you can lose relatively easily. But what I see a lot of people saying is, gosh, Paul, it's really nice to be able to eat, you know, double the amount of food that I used to, but gosh, I wish I didn't gain those 2 to 3 pounds. Well, those 2 to 3 pounds ultimately end up being what your body needed. And when you say to someone that was eating 1,300 calories and they can end up eating 2,200 to 2,300 calories, that's not an insignificant thing, right? And you know, we just want to get people out of this fat loss all the time mindset. And even coming up on the fat loss challenge, for a lot of people that have been dieting, they're going, well, gosh, you know, it seems like I don't have any way of functioning. Well, absolutely you do, because even though your goal is fat loss, if you were to build 5 to 6 pounds of muscle and stay the same weight, that is fat loss, folks. You know, I mean, people go, well, how can I get abs? Abs are muscles. You know, I mean, there's a certain extent, you know, abs are built in the kitchen. I kind of agree with that, but honestly, I think that gives people the right to have a disordered relationship with food. I think the majority of your life you should be building muscle and expanding who you are as an individual, rather than constantly looking to minimize yourself to some unrealistic goal that, you know, frankly, I mean, when I went through my process, you know, and you look at the person I was at 225 compared to the person that I was at 150, and then right now, you know, I'm a little under 180. I kind of looked the same in all of them, right? It was just like a smaller version or a little bit better version or a little leaner version. But if you think that you're going to be like 100% different individual, lose that mentality right now, you know? I mean, part of the big deal is, you know, to kind of just make peace with yourself in the process. And I can tell you that the way that I viewed things mentally 5 to 6 years ago when I first started things is much more refreshing now, you know, because it's just who I am. And so working towards strength goals, working towards performance goals, working towards fat loss goals, all these things are all a bigger part of the picture. I think for a lot of people, you know, yeah, they kind of like to get stronger. Yeah, they kind of like to get a little bit better at workouts, but then they really want to get rid of fat loss. It's like when fat loss becomes lower on the priority list and kind of more equal to all these other goals, that's when it becomes a little bit easier and more sustainable over a lifetime. David asked the question a long while ago, and I unfortunately am just getting to it. I have trouble getting my macros on track because the rest of the family does not eat like I want to. Any suggestions? Well, yeah, I think that, well, I'm just curious, like, what you mean, how you want to eat. You know, I have 2 teenage daughters. One of the things that I don't want to do for them, I'd like to teach them some healthy habits, but, you know, oftentimes, you know, there's other teenagers drinking Monster drinks and things of this nature. And my nature is not to be super restrictive related to things like that. I think it just sets up a bad relationship with food at a very young age, and I'd rather just give them, more and better information. But they still like eating pizza, probably more than I would eat pizza. They probably still would rather rely on more convenient choices than actually sitting down and making a meal or something of this nature. Um, I would say that, for my wife and I, we tend to make meals that fit our goals, but we will often have a meal for my children that's different than their goals. And I don't think that that's setting up a bad relationship with them or you or whatever. Often what you will see is when people are making good life healthy changes. So let's say, for instance, David's wife was not very supportive of his situation. Maybe she wants to eat less than he does, and he needs to actually eat an adequate amount of food. So maybe she is eating mostly vegetables, lean chicken all the time, and that's really not going to help his goals as it relates to getting to be a better athlete and things of this nature. There's no reason why having some starch, while she's not having the starch, would be a negative, right? As an example, my daughters don't always like to eat steak. We will often have chicken tenders with them as an alternative. I think it just requires some level of planning. My family teases me often because I like to eat the same things over and over, and so I typically grill up like 3 packages of chicken. I will make taco meat as an example. I'll make chili. Most of these meals my family likes in some way, shape, or form. They probably tend to be a little bit more flexible than I am. Kids get a lot of different messages at this age, and so I was just at a concert with my daughter, and the vegan thing is like a really big deal, at venues like that. And so your kids get these messages, and they hear these messages. My daughter comes home, and talks about, they keep saying I should be eating, 30% of my things should be from whole grains. And while we don't suggest to them that they should avoid grains like as an example paleo would, we don't eat a lot of grains. I will eat oats, as it relates to my goals as an athlete. But in general, my grain consumption is relatively low because, the food I tend to eat, I like to have more micronutrients or vitamins. I like them to be sufficient in macronutrients, the main macronutrient being protein. And so I would just say that often if you force your family to conform to the way that you think, you will be fighting a battle that you won't win, because what ends up happening is if you're just starting down the path, in terms of Eat to Perform, it should be really easy for Eat to Perform, because if, as an example, your family is eating in a paleo way, just adding strategic starches is no big deal. But if your family is eating mostly processed foods and things of this nature, and then you're trying to move to mostly unprocessed foods, you know, is going to test your will. But I think the way that you address that is by being more prepared, not less prepared. I'm just going to tell you this right now. If your wife is eating Ben and Jerry's and she's not really being super supportive of your way of thinking and you're hungry, you're going to eat that Ben and Jerry's. So, and in general, you know, your family, you know, we hear this a lot. They aren't always super supportive in these situations, and the reason why they aren't is because, you know, they kind of like everybody to do the same thing, or they may feel some guilt the way, you know, about their situation. In my view, your wife, as an example, might be able to eat, you know, differently than you eat and support her goals. So what you're doing isn't necessarily what she needs to do. But if, for instance, you were overeating, eating mostly processed foods, things of this nature, and you're moving to more of a purposeful way of eating, the absolute best strategy for you is to be as prepared as you can at all times. And I see this often when I am eating at a deficit. I don't, like I said earlier, I don't often eat at a deficit, so it doesn't end up being that big of a deal for me. So I can, on occasion, go eat ice cream with my family or have pizza with my wife on date night and things of this nature. I think those should all be part of somebody's plan. But when you are looking for fat loss, yes, you know, you're going to be a little bit cranky sometimes. Yes, you're going to be eating foods that, you know, aren't going to be as enjoyable as your family members are. And, you know, that's just something that you're going to have to set behaviors up that allow you to be successful, and you really have to kind of be committed to that. And part of that commitment isn't just will and sucking it up and eating poorly. It's a matter of planning. And so, you know, in the past, you know, on Sundays, as an example, I would make a lot of food. That isn't something that I necessarily need to do at this point. But when I'm in a situation like you're describing, it is of the utmost of importance, because your will is going to be weakened when you're trying to eat with purpose. And I'm even still talking about, you know, let's say that you're eating in a mostly paleo way, trying to get in about 3,000 calories as an example, and you're really trying to kind of push the issue as it relates to your performance. That might not give you a lot of room. Like, for instance, let's say that you have Vitargo, which is a carb post-workout, and so you drink that intra-workout, post-workout. Well, that's great, and that might be helping your performance, but it's also 70 grams of carbohydrate. It's 280 calories. So if you're only eating, you know, 3,000 calories a day, now you're at 2,700. Then you add some protein, right? So you add a protein shake. Maybe that's 50 grams of protein. That's another 200. So you start to see kind of diminishing windows that really don't allow for ice cream or pizza or some of these other things. Not saying that those can't have a place, but I'm just saying sometimes that eating for a purpose does diminish your window for things that are kind of a little outside of the box. You know, the other day, you know, I was kind of stuck eating Jimmy John's, came home, looked at the protein, and it's like nothing. You know, I mean, processed meats, you know, I think, you know, it was something like 32 grams of protein. Normally in a meal of that size for that calories, I would want to have 65 to 70 grams of protein. So I'm guessing that David left, so I'm hoping that he will see this eventually, because you know, I'm sort of winging it on what was the purpose of his question, but I hope that was helpful as it relates to an answer. Anyway, that's going to be the last question. Okay, he's still here. So David, did that answer what you were saying, or did it kind of address, or was it totally off on a tangent different than what you intended? Because this is actually the last question, and so he might be actually writing a response, so it might just take a second for him to respond. But yeah, I'm going to tell you, it is kind of hard, especially when you're sort of eating in a specific way. Let's see, I addressed it. My family likes processed foods. Yeah, I mean, I would say the best strategy that you can have, I'll give you an example. My family, right? My daughter often talks about the fact that it's tough being the Eat to Perform guy. You know, even though Eat to Perform is very flexible, and you can have a lot of choices. You know, I understand as a 14-year-old girl that you know, who's probably a little rebellious, that it might be difficult to be the Eat to Perform guy's daughter, right? My youngest daughter, on another example, though, I mean, it wasn't too many years ago where, you know, eating Stouffer's lasagna was in play. You know, my kids were like 5 and 6 years old when we started to make this change. Well, when we made the change, my youngest daughter adapted to it really well. My youngest daughter competes in triathlons and eats, you know, with a purpose. My oldest daughter tries to be active. She's not as active as my younger daughter. Her food choices aren't always the best, but I don't think that they're super bad. I think that she could be a little bit more conscious as it relates to the way that she eats. But the best thing you can do is set an example and let it go, because the reason why you're doing this is for you. And so if you fix you first and make the journey about you, then it won't be that big of a deal. If you start to make it my journey's success is dependent on you guys stop eating processed foods, you will fail. And so what I would suggest is just to make sure that you're prepared. And if I were to ask you what you're going to eat for your next meal, you should always have an answer for me, right? And if your answer is I don't know, well, guess what? You'll be eating Ben and Jerry's later, you know, because that's what's in your house. And so you have to have a plan, you know, and I would not use this as a way of, you know, forcing it onto your family, but there's probably some level of control that you have as it relates to the groceries that you buy, right? And so that's how I control it. You know, I say to my daughters, you can get anything you want at the grocery store. Anything you want. You can buy any single item, even if I don't like it. But if they come to the grocery store with me, they see the habits that I'm trying to create. Now, I do the grocery shopping for my family. And so we will often try and get them, because there's sometimes they'll buy something and they don't even realize that there's a healthier option for them. So I try to steer them to the more healthy option rather than constantly focus on the super processed, you know, stuff that's on TV and Cheetos and things of this nature. There's always strategies that you can look towards. But that's where I think the naughty and nice list of paleo can really start to add up to some negative behaviors, because you might be looking at it as a positive interaction for your family, but they're just not there yet. And so set the example, over time, now that it's been years, 5, 6, 7 years into this process, you know, um, even in the case of my daughter, who was slightly reluctant to join the party, that's okay. We'll try and get her, down the path. But I already see her as an example. We had her doing CrossFit. She became a little reluctant to the CrossFit thing. We didn't push it because we didn't want to kind of create this negative relationship with CrossFit. Then she wanted to start doing skating. Now she skates all the time. Is it the absolute best thing for her at all times? I don't know, but she's moving, so I don't really care. Whatever it takes to establish healthy behaviors, I think, is what you try to do. But if you force it too much, oftentimes it ends up being a negative, and they'll rebel against it. And so you look for your spots. And I think ultimately that it ends up being the best approach. But I'd be lying to you if I said I had all the answers there, because we do struggle. But I can tell you that my wife, my youngest daughter, and myself, we all are pretty active. We are, eat well. My oldest daughter, I don't think that she eats poorly or she is inactive, but I would just say that she's a little bit of a victim of all of her friends, and things that they eat and things that they talk about, and she just hasn't embraced it yet, and hopefully she will. There was a time she certainly did. At one point, as an example, we participated in a paleo challenge with our gym, and one of the advantages to her was having clear skin, and it did it. It cleared up her skin for that month, and that kind of got her on the path of pursuing some healthier choices. But they're kids, and they sort of get roped into some convenient behaviors, and what we try to do is just be more prepared. And if your child, as an example, that's the other strategy, by the way. The other strategy is don't have bad stuff in your house. If your wife is unsupportive, that makes that difficult. But in general, no, I don't have bad stuff in my house. If my daughter wants potato chips, she's got to go to the store. She got to walk 1.5 miles to go get it. Now, if we're driving at a store and she wants to get some potato chips or something of that nature, she is certainly welcome to do so. She has her own money. She is perfectly fine. I would never, ever stop her from doing that. But in general, the food in our house is adding to the equation and typically not taking away from the equation. So you'll have to figure out what it is for you, but truthfully, your journey is about you. Your resignation needs to be about you. And as long as you can kind of keep that in line, they'll show up later. Trust me, my daughter, if she starts to struggle with her weight or things of this nature, she does have the Eat to Perform guy in her house. So if she, wants to use me as a resource, I'll always be there. I've also said to her, if she struggles mentally, things of this nature, she can talk to April, which is the forum administrator. She and April have a little bit of a relationship just through when we travel to North Carolina and things of that nature. And so I don't want her to make poor choices because she doesn't feel like she can communicate with me related to food, because I realize that sometimes that can be a little bit of a pressure. And so to have some other options, I think, is a negative thing, or I think is a positive thing. But also I think you need to maybe not be so rigid as well. My daughter, as an example, when she goes to school a little bit later than most of the other kids, so we end up buying her lunch. Not uncommon for me to buy her Subway. I don't think Subway is actually that bad of a thing on occasion. If you view Subway as a negative thing, then that might be a little bit of the issue. You know, for a child that is healthy and moving around and doing things, you know, having Subway, you know, every, you know, once or twice a week is really not all that bad. You may view it as negative for your choices, but I would separate yourself from that equation. So I hope that's helpful. It's just a perspective. Hopefully you can figure, you know, what works for you and your family, and you know, maybe I gave you some suggestions that'll allow you to do that. So anyway, we'll end on that note. We did end up going a little bit longer, but you guys came up with so many great questions that it ended up being pretty awesome. And I will talk to you later. If you don't, as an example, get to make it to any of these webinars, they're always posted in the forums, and you can check them out after that. So appreciate everybody being here, and I'm going to sign off.